Hi, I'm Dr. Sadhna Bokhiria, and this is Leader Voices, a show about leaders and their infinite ability to change the world. Each episode in Leader Voices, we dig into stories and sparks from for-purpose leaders, coaches, comedians, luminaries, and everyday heroes from around the globe. Tales of impact and failing forward, of aspirations and innovations, and the infinite and inspiring ways that social purpose leaders lead and make the world a better place. Join us today as we introduce a new guest. I'm so excited to introduce Dr. Ron Cohen. He is the founder, president, and CEO of Accorda Therapeutics, which is a company developing therapies for disorders of the nervous system with approved therapies for Parkinson's disease and multiple sclerosis. Previously, he was the principal and officer of Advanced Tissue Sciences, a company growing human organ tissues for medical use. Dr. Cohen is the past chair of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, where he continues to serve as a director and was director and chair of the New York Biotechnology Association. He has served on several corporate boards, including VBL Therapeutics and Diax Corp. He received the Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of Year Award for the New York Metropolitan Region and the New York CEO Lifetime Achievement Award. If that wasn't enough, Dr. Cohen has been recognized by Scientific American as one of the 100 most influential people in biotech by PR Week, M&M, and one of the Health Influencers 50, and by Pharma Voice magazine as one of the 100 most inspirational people in the biopharmaceutical industry. You can tell that I'm stuttering because I'm really nervous. He was named Neuro Investment CEO of the Year and was awarded Columbia University's Alumni Medal for Distinguished Service. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to Leader Voices, and I just have to start by saying thank you for joining us. Clearly, you are a wonder kid. How did you get involved in healthcare?
Well, I'm a bit overwhelmed by that introduction, but I do want to thank you because I'm going to make sure my mom sees it.
She must be very proud. I know she is.
We're celebrating her 96th birthday this weekend. So there you go. Well, thank you for having me on, Sadhna. It's a pleasure to be here. You asked how I got to do what I'm doing. It was complete serendipity. And I originally trained as a doctor. I'm a board certified internist. I practiced medicine for a number of years. And prior to that, I had a dilemma, which was whether I was going to practice medicine or try to have a career in the theater, because that was my other great love in life. And I'd been doing theater since first grade all the time. So I like to say I chickened out and went to medical school instead, because someone told me that, asked me what they call the student with the lowest grade point average in your medical school class. What are they called? And they're called doctor. And so, whereas with theater, it's a lot of hit and miss. So I did do that. I had a wonderful time in medical school. I did my residency. When I finally got to be with patients, that really did it for me. Third year in medical school, they let you on the floors in the hospital. And the very first patient I saw was an elderly woman who was lying in bed or sitting up in bed. And I walked in my little medical student my white pants, my white shirt, my white jacket, and my stethoscope. And she looked up and she said, "Good morning, doctor." And of course, I wasn't a doctor yet, but there was something about the way she said it that I actually felt a bit overwhelmed, because it was clear to me that she was ill and she thought I could help her and she needed me to help her. So the responsibility of that just washed over me, and it never left. So I finished my residency, and then I was all set to do a neurology residency after my medicine residency. I was getting ready to apply. My dad had been a neurologist. He practiced till he was 87. Interestingly, when he was younger, he wanted to go into the theater. So I came by the whole dilemma honestly. And my mom was a concert violinist, so that just added more intrigue. I like to tell this story because especially when younger folks ask me about it, and when I'm mentoring people in biotech and elsewhere, it's maybe the single biggest lesson I ever learned, which is that opportunity always comes. You have to know when it's there. And then when you know it's there, you have to jump, and you can't doubt yourself. You can't overthink it. You just got to do it because your gut is telling you the way to go. And in this case, it was third year of residency. We were doing every third night on call back then. So we were doing 36-hour shifts. I really loved the whole thing because we were taking care of one patient after another and learning. But I had a 3-month stint where I wasn't going to have night call for 3 months because it was a primary care rotation where we were learning how to do office medicine during the day. So that's what I was doing with the university professors. And right before that started, I opened up the Charlottesville, Virginia newspaper. I was at UVA, and they were advertising auditions for one of my 2 favorite musicals in the world. And the lead role was a role I always had wanted to play and never had. So I thought just on a lark, I would audition knowing I wouldn't get the part because this was not school. This was a big regional theater in Virginia. So I auditioned and I got the part. And I proceeded to do this show, and we got a very, very good review in the local paper. And when I saw the review, I thought, well, if I can get a review in Charlottesville, maybe I can get a review in New York City, which is my hometown. So I put the neurology residency on the back burner. I thought I'd come back to it. And I went to New York, my hometown, and I spent 5 years trying to be an actor.
Wow.
And I got an acting teacher who turned out to be the most influential teacher I ever had. And I was practicing medicine to support myself. So I was working in emergency rooms mostly and in urgent care centers so that I didn't have night call and I could control my schedule. And I was having a fabulous time, 1 foot in the medical world, 1 foot in the theater world. About midway through, one day, a couple of my friends from medical school, where I went to Columbia, New York, they had met and married out of my class, and we stayed friends. They called me one day, said, "Hey, Ron, we want you to meet a couple of friends of ours. It's another married couple. They're PhDs. They just left NYU, where they invented a technology for growing human tissues in vitro in a dish in 3 dimensions. And they want to do banking. So they're growing bone marrow for people who might need bone marrow transplants and so on. So they started a little biotech company, and they asked us to find a doctor who could do clinical things. So I said, why are you calling me? I have no business background. I don't know anything about tissue engineering and growing organs. Why are you calling me? And they said, well, because our friends were very specific. They said, could you recommend any doctor who has presentational skills, who can present well to investors and other doctors and scientists? And so they said, well, look, you're a theater guy. You can do this. So I said, you understand that this is the lamest job description I have ever heard.
They weren't selling it.
And I said, look, as a favor to you, I'll meet them, but I'm not joining some cockamamie company. I don't know anything about this. So it was a lovely day in May, a Friday. And they picked me up in a cab and took me to their office down near NYU on 33rd Street, New York. And the whole company was the 2 scientists, a nurse that they had hired to do bone marrow extractions in the clinic, and then they could freeze the bone marrow and they could do their work, and a dentist from Albany, New York, who was a friend of the family, who was the angel investor. He was putting in a few $100,000 to get them started. That was the company. So I spent a half a day with them, 4 hours, and they took me through the science, and it was fascinating. I'm a science geek. I love this stuff. I love biology and medicine. And they were growing 3-dimensional tissues. It was, back then, you're talking about 1986. I hesitate to admit that, but it was stunning. So after that, the woman of the two, her name was Gail, she was the entrepreneur. She was the one who was trying to do the company. Her husband was purely in the lab. So she takes me to a little office and we're sitting across. She goes, "What do you think?" And I said, "I think it's fascinating." And she goes, "Great. I want you to work with me." Just like that. And this is where what I've started with comes in. That's a bizarre experience, right? I had not had to interview for a job since working at a Burger King one summer in college. So I thought, this is weird. I mean, I barely know them, and now she's asking me, but all right. So I said something like, "Tell you what, I'm flattered. Why don't we talk next week?" And she looks at me, and this is word for word. She points at me across the table and goes, "You don't understand." And I said, "Whoa, wow, I think I understand." She goes, "No." And she opens the drawer, pulls out a piece of paper, slides it across, and I'm reading it. It's an employment agreement with a salary and a title, VP of medical, whatever. And I'm looking at it, and I suddenly realize something even more bizarre. And I say to her, "Wait a minute, my name is typed right here at the top. When did you type this? I've been with you all morning." And she said, "I typed it last night." I said, "You didn't know me last night." And she said, "Well, our friends who put us together sent me 2 videotapes of you on TV that they recorded." And I was trying to be an actor, and I had been on, I'd been on a couple of things on TV, although one of them was as a doctor. So that's another story. And she said, "I looked at those tapes, and based on that, I absolutely knew that we had to work together." So I looked at her, I said, wow, I'm really, really flattered now. Let me take this paper home. I'll read it and we'll talk next week. And once again, she goes, "You don't understand." And she stands up, and she was tall. She was about 5'10", maybe 6 feet in heels. And she leans over the table, points at the signature line and goes, "I want you to sign here." And she points right in front of my nose. That was the moment that changed everything, because I knew it was bizarre, and I suddenly felt almost disassociated. I felt like I was in a movie. And then I started seeing my life going backwards, like a movie reel in the front of my head. And when the movie reel stopped, which was probably only a few seconds, I looked up and I said, "Okay." And I signed. And then I came to work for this company, this nothing company. Eventually, it was called Advanced Tissue Sciences. That's what got me into biotech. And I had no rational right or business doing this. But in the moment, I felt compelled. I didn't know why, but it just felt like, okay, let's do this. And I've never looked back.
It's incredible. There's so many aspects of the relationship between science and the humanities, and understanding the value of strong communication skills. I interact with a lot of different scientists, and many times I find that they are really great at the nitty-gritty in terms of, the science. And then with the conversation skills, sometimes there's a little bit more of a pull. And so I find it really fascinating that you have this background where, you're obviously really knowledgeable in the medical field, but then you have something pulling your heartstring in the humanities and the arts and theater. And then you land this role where she basically said, "No, we're not taking no for an answer, Dr. Cohen. We already drew up the contract last night before we even met you, because we saw you on TV and we know you're the one." It's an incredible calling. It's very inspirational.
You know what? Hearing you tell it back to me, I'm actually amazed all over again. I do have a very funny little quick anecdote. Right after this was on a Friday. My parents lived in New York. My dad, the neurologist, and when they knew when I was in college that I was, medicine, acting, medicine, and which way they wanted me to go. And they didn't say a word. They were very smart, because they knew if they said a word, I would go the other way, and they didn't want that. So they held their tongues. When I chose medicine, you could just see the relief every time I saw them, right? So now I come home and it's Sunday. They're sitting in the living room reading the Sunday Times. And I burst in and I tell them this whole story that I just told you, exactly like I just told it to you. And I finish and I go, so Mom, Dad, I'm going to give up the acting. I'm giving up the practice of medicine and I'm going to work for this biotech company. What do you think? And my dad said one of the funniest things to this day he ever said to me. There was a pause, right? They were in shock. And then I said, Mom, Dad, say something. And my dad turns around and he goes, son, are you sure you don't want to reconsider the acting career?
Words you probably never thought you'd hear.
And I'm telling you, when he said it, I sat there, I thought, oh my God, what have I done?
It's like a poker game and some reverse psychology involved with.
Yeah, that's right.
Incredible.
But we didn't know what we were doing. Nobody. They were scientists. I was a doctor, would-be actor. We didn't know what we were doing, and we bebopped around, and we just had to invent it on our own. And eventually, we did, and got a real CEO from the Eli Lilly pharmaceutical company to come in, and he became my first mentor in business, and that we took it from there.
Incredible. Incredible. So now you've had a lot of experience in the academic industry, academic medicine, and in the pharma industry. Talk to me a little bit about the polarization of academic medicine and the pharma industry.
So thank you. That's actually one of my constant missions, is to try to contribute constructively to that, to the resolution of that issue. So even when I was in medical school, and we're going back a long way, this is in the late 70s, early 80s, even then, there was always a bias within academic medicine against pharmaceuticals. But then it was more along the lines of, hey, we are the elite here in terms of medical knowledge and advancing the frontier and doing research. And pharmaceuticals, that's just business and it's kind of unsavory and we don't do that. So if any student ever expressed the desire to maybe see what it was like to develop drugs at these companies, they were very firmly and yet gently dissuaded from doing so. So that I took that to be an ignorant elitism. Okay. If you fast forward to where we are now, and certainly what's happened over the last, let's call it 10 plus years, it's only gotten worse. And it's gotten worse in very measurable and very toxic ways that actually make medicine less patient-centric than it should be. And that winds up hurting all of us. Anyone who's ill and needs to see a doctor or be in the healthcare system, any of our loved ones who are ill, because we're not getting the best that our society has to offer. And why is that? Well, so it starts with what people perceive to be, and I think correctly, as the high cost of new drugs, of branded drugs. And unfortunately, no one is taught about what it all really means and how the whole system works. I'll be the first one to say that the healthcare system in the United States is both the best in the world and among the worst in the world. If you're wealthy and you have gold-plated insurance, it's the best in the world. You have access to the most advanced medicines, the most advanced procedures in the world. But if you are middle class or even upper middle class or anything less than that in terms of income, you've got real issues, because your ability to pay for the medicines you need, but even the procedures you need, even the surgeries you need, even the hospitalizations you need, is minimal. It's low. And our system has not solved for that. What it has done is it has resorted to pointing fingers. So everyone's in a circle with guns pointing inside the circle. And you've got the academic medical centers that now will not let pharmaceutical people in, even if they're doctors, even if they're PhDs. they won't let them in to engage in dialogue because their view is you're just trying to make money and sell us your drug, and you're perverting and biasing our practice of medicine. That's their point of view. Our point of view is, yeah, we are charging for these medicines because that's the way the system works. That's what incentivizes companies to get, actually, not even companies, it's what incentivizes investors to put money at huge risk to try to develop these drugs with a 1 in 10 chance of success every time on average. And if they don't have that one drug make up for the losses on the other 9 or 90%, they don't invest anymore. And and then we'd be using today the same medicines we used 30 years ago. Okay. So there's this tension that our system has not solved for, but the solution cannot be that I'm going around giving talks showing that hospitals are guilty of extremely bad behavior. Insurance companies are guilty of extremely bad behavior. Pharmaceutical companies are guilty of extremely bad behavior in a minority of cases. But what we've done is we now generalize and say pharma is all bad, hospitals are all bad, insurance companies are all bad, pharmacies are all bad. And that when that happens, that polarization leads to a complete shutting down of interaction and dialogue. So I'll give you a very real example. We developed what we think is a very important drug, and which patients think is important for people with Parkinson's disease. And it's an inhaler that allows them to inhale an important drug and get very rapid relief of their symptoms when they need it. Because it's not a pill, you have to train people how to use it. Otherwise, you'll fail, right? Just like an asthma inhaler, you have to train how to use it.
Sure.
We want to go in and train doctors at these hospitals and the nurses and everyone else how to use it. They don't let us in. So they prescribe it. The patients aren't able to do it. They stop using it and nobody benefits, right? So what's happened is I go personally now and give talks. I've given almost 40 talks at 40 different academic medical centers. Why? Because I am an MD, and given my position, they kind of make an exception for me and let me come in and give a talk. But it shouldn't rely on that. It should be a transparent exchange of information. By the way, nobody knows more about a new drug than the people who invented it and developed it in pharma biotech companies. Nobody knows more about how to use those drugs clinically than the doctors, nurses, and others in medical practice. What you need is everyone to come together and exchange the knowledge that they have. That's not what happens now, by and large, and it's toxic to patient care. So we need to get around that. And there's a whole issue around drug pricing and why are drug prices so high? And we can certainly talk about that. But what I will tell you is, like most things, there's far more than meets the eye there. And people need to be educated about it.
Sure. So, how can academic institutions maintain their independence and their integrity while collaborating with the pharmaceutical industry? Is it something where we, incorporate ensure that this type of curriculum is included in their training? So as they're in, school and they're learning about the industry, that's integral to their curriculum. What else would you say?
So you've anticipated me, and that's just fantastic. Maybe we should promote this together. I've been promoting exactly what you just said. I have been going to medical schools and recommending or suggesting to them that they seriously consider including these issues in their curricula for medical students and nursing students so that they have an education about, like, mommy, where do drugs come from? Right? Because they don't know. Most of them have no clue about what I didn't before I got into this business. I had no clue. And it opened my eyes. And by the way, the vast majority of people that I know and work with in our industry and in biopharmaceuticals are fantastic people. They're motivated to do good in the world. They're motivated to help people, to help patients. They all understand that they themselves can be patients, that their loved ones can be patients, and it's personal. Um, are there bad actors? Absolutely, there are bad actors. That's true in every walk of life. And as I said, there are a bunch of hospitals out there, for example, that have been in the news because they take money from the government to serve indigent patients. And then when the patients can't pay, they sue them and throw them out of their houses.
Yeah.
This goes on. You don't hear much about it. So everyone needs to police is the wrong word, but everyone needs to be transparent about their own shops, right? And someone, famous saying that the best antidote against corruption or against infection is sunlight. Sunlight is the best antiseptic. So what you need to do is have everyone be transparent. Where's the money going? Who's getting the money? Why are they getting the money? And once you know that, you can make decisions, right? I gave a talk last year at a major medical center. They invited me to give neurology grand rounds, which was great. So I gave a talk about this topic, not about my drug, about this topic. And you could see people's eyes opening when I was explaining how these different things work. Near the end of the talk, I put up the conflict of interest form that their institution sent me before I was allowed to talk, that I had to fill out and say, which was fine. I mean, I think that's exactly right, except that right at the top, it said, please fill out this form to help us protect our learning environment against the influence of industry. So I'm sitting there looking at it saying, well, wait a minute. They're inviting me as a representative of industry to give a talk. Am I not supposed to influence them? So I highlighted it and I put it up on a slide at the end. I said, now I just want you all to see what I'm talking about in very real terms. I got this from this institution that I'm speaking at today. And the whole room went silent. Everyone's reading it and you could see the expressions. It's like, oh my God. And the chairman of neurology at the department was there, and he looked up and he looked at me and he said, I didn't know that was in that form. He said, I want to apologize to you. And he looked at everyone else in the department. He said, I'm embarrassed. We are an institution that says that we're an institution of learning and exchange of ideas. And he said, this talk that Dr. Cohen just gave, he gave it in shades of gray, and we're black and white. He says, that's got to stop. To his credit. So it's going to take a while, but I think we need a lot of us who know about this out there giving the other side of the story, because it's bad for medicine and it's bad for patients and it's bad for our health to have this kind of polarization going on.
Sure, understandable whenever you make assumptions, right? It's that bad news bears quote. Whenever you make an assumption, you make an ass out of you and me.
That's right.
So tell me a little bit about innovation in the biopharma industry and some of the exciting things that you've observed in recent years.
The pace of innovation in biopharmaceuticals and medicine is at a speed now that makes my head spin. Because I've watched it up close and personal for almost 40 years, right? You're talking about 38 years now. It's accelerating logarithmically, right? So it's not going, one step, next step. It's going one step and then a step that's 10 times as big and another step that's 10 times as big. So the things that I see today that didn't even exist, when I started out, gene therapy, things like CRISPR technology, which won the Nobel Prize, that allows very rapid correction or alteration of very specific locations in our DNA, such as disease locations, right? We have technologies like RNA interference and mRNA that led to the vaccines for COVID and now are going to be used for vaccines, for other things, for cancer, and so on. We have cell therapies. We have immune system therapies that can now rev up the immune system and target your cancer. We're able to cure cancers now in a way that was unheard of 20 years ago, 15 years ago. Some people in your audience may remember Jimmy Carter had metastatic melanoma. That's that skin cancer that's deadly. When I was a resident, one of the worst memories I had was of a young man in his 30s who had metastatic melanoma. We couldn't do anything, and he died of it. Right now, Jimmy Carter had it all over his body. It was metastatic. They gave him this immune therapy, and they effectively cured it. Now, that's not true for everyone yet, but the fact that it's true for anyone is a modern medical miracle. We have the ability now to take cells from the pancreas, grow cells, engineer them, put them back in the body of someone with diabetes, and they don't have to use insulin anymore. That's it's still in progress, but the first cases they've done looks like it absolutely works. I could go on. It's just, and then the era of the brain, the things we're able to do in the brain and growing nerves and repairing nerves, the things we're doing with devices like, everyone's heard about Elon Musk's company, but there are several companies working on devices that electronically can replace the functions of diseased tissue. So people with spinal cord injury, for example, can think and then raise their arm, that kind of thing. It's stunning, which makes it even more important that what you and I were just talking about gets solved, because we cannot allow anything to stand in the way of that progress. And we are allowing it in some cases to do that.
Now you took the words out of my mouth, because my next question was having to do with essentially with all these rapid advancements in biopharma, what ethical considerations should the industry address while they're so quickly advancing?
Well, I suppose it depends on the specific case, because for the most part, I don't see ethical issues, right? There are cautionary issues about if you have I'm sorry if you're hearing my dog bark. She's excited probably by what I'm about to say.
Smart dog.
There are issues with proceeding in a rational and judicious way, because the first tenet of medicine is first, do no harm. So before you do good, do no harm. And when we're talking about gene therapy, which is still it's been around for 20 years in a way, 15 years, but not the potential has been around ever since the human genome was sequenced, and then we've developed all these tools. But only in very recent years have actual gene therapies come out that are approved and are now being used in people. So we're at the very early stages. And what everyone needs to be careful about is if you're going in and you're messing with the genome, which is what controls us and everything we are and all of our systems, you have to be careful that you're not screwing something up that you're not aware of. So you think, hey, I am curing hemophilia because I'm putting in stem cells in the bone marrow that have the correct gene for hemoglobin, for clotting factors. I was mixing up my diseases. For clotting factors that you're missing. But what if at the same time I've altered another gene or set of genes that over time might cause cancer? All right. And then you need to be careful about that. So I will tell you, I don't see anyone in this country running amok with all this, because we have the FDA. The FDA for all the issues that people raise about FDA and so on, it's an essential institution with a lot of smart scientists and physicians and others who look out for exactly this. So there is a system of checks and balances where if a company comes in and says, well, we have this great therapy for, let's say hemophilia, and we want to put it in patients, FDA is going to insist on enough safety data, and then they're going to insist that you go gradually. You start with a few very carefully defined patients, you observe them, and then you go from there. The risks, more than from companies, I think, in this country, are in countries that don't take that approach, and also for individual laboratories where there isn't as much oversight. So people generally can do what they want for a while. And there, I don't have an answer there. There are institutional controls and regulations, but you can always have someone who decides, hey, I'm bigger than the system and I know that this is the way to go. And then they go and they might hurt people. Sure. What saves us there is that even in that case, if someone wants to put any kind of science to work in a human being out of a university, not a company, because they do that, or the NIH, not a company, they still have to justify what they're doing to what's called an institutional review board, where experts come around a table, review what they want to do, and then either allow it or allow it with conditions or don't allow it. So, when you're talking about ethics, I suppose that where it really comes into play is when you start messing with what's called the germline. So the germline is it's the XY of the X and Y of who we are. The germline is the fundamental part of the genome that gets transmitted from generation to generation, where people say, hey, let's make superhumans. Let's make babies. I don't like blonde hair. I want a baby with brown hair. I don't want boys. I want girls. So those are things that society has to have conversations about. What do we think is ethical? What do we think is permitted? What shouldn't be? That frankly is beyond me. That has to be a societal conversation because a lot goes into it, and different people interpret ethical issues in different ways. I keep coming back to the first principle, which is first, do no harm.
Sure. What's interesting to me, because I'm a literature buff, so the first thing that comes to my mind is the way in which you can develop the empathy and explore these vast notions of ethics and just capabilities. So I think Mary Shelley, Frankenstein, just thinking about something that a teenager wrote that explored something that was so before her time that really nails down all these things that you're discussing. So what would you say in terms of the role of the humanities to have literature, as going full circle back to our initial kind of conversation, having that essential component to develop some of those higher order critical thinking skills through literature?
I couldn't agree more. And in fact, the medical school that I was fortunate to get into and go to is Columbia in New York. And the reason I went there instead of elsewhere was because they take an approach that is directly in line with what you just asked me and what you just proposed. So, with a lot of medical schools, they're looking for people with 4.0 averages and who have demonstrated tremendous academic expertise and skill and prowess. And that's all proper and good, because you want people who are smart and know how to learn and can learn the complexities of medicine. But what Columbia does is they deliberately look for people from the humanities, not just the sciences. They look for musicians, dancers, actors, writers, poets, anthropologists. I'm naming people, or I'm describing people who were in my class. We had a guy who was I think he was 30, which is late for medical school, but he had spent the prior 5, 6 years in the Amazon studying and living with indigenous peoples in the Amazon as an anthropologist. We had someone in one of the classes when I was there who had danced with the American Ballet Theater, amazingly enough. So what they did there was they deliberately brought in people who could provide a rich humanistic environment in the medical school. And so what happened was we put on 2 full-scale musicals a year with orchestra and lights and sets in the medical school. I, of course, auditioned for all the shows, but we had an orchestra, we had musicians, we had chamber music groups, we had athletes as well, who had been very accomplished athletes. It was an incredibly rich and humanistic environment, and the conversations, therefore, ascended the science only. Of course, they included the science, but they always included that humanistic piece about human beings. We're treating human beings here. And how do you relate to them? How do you communicate with them? How do you learn what is going on so you can help them better? I was a big fan. So the bottom line is you might have a 3.5 average GPA, but if you were an accomplished musician or had excelled in another one of these humanistic fields, they might take you over someone who had a 4.0 who spent their whole time in the library and had no extracurricular life.
Sure. That gives me so much comfort and hope. I haven't heard of a program that would, especially at that level, that specifically valued that in their admissions process. So I really appreciate you sharing that, because I think that our audience would really find comfort in that as well. And just knowing that power in literature has always been something that really moves me.
You know, my bias, ever since I graduated, for better or worse, my bias has always been that if I have a choice of sending or referring a friend or a colleague or a family member to a doctor who I know graduated from Columbia Medical School versus one who didn't, my bias is to go to the Columbia one. Because in general, and look, nothing's 100%, right? We had our own share of people who were brilliant, had 4.3 averages, and we're not particularly gifted at communicating with human beings, so, but probably made fantastic medical researchers.
Sure. Yeah, it happens. It happens in every industry, as you say. There's no such thing as that 100%. But if you have that foundation, and that foundation has those values incorporated into the curriculum, where it's a safe space, especially for creatives, you know, that safe space is so critical. And you know, through my research, that it multiplies intelligence. You know, it enhances your ability to do math and science, because when you're engaging in the humanities and you're engaging in creativity, especially laughter, every single part of your brain that's associated with higher order thinking, the smartest parts of your brain, light up. And it makes it a lot easier for you to, like if you were to do a laughter exercise and then do some type of a test that was mathematical or scientific, you're more likely to be successful in doing that after practicing a little bit of creative laughter. So it's wonderful that they're integrating that.
Yes, and that, you know, that I was very struck with what you've done with stand-up comedy in that regard. And it's all of a piece. It's the same essential, I think, truth, which is it doesn't matter. It does not only matter that you're smart and brilliant and, you know, and can invent wonderful medicines and science. That matters a lot. But it also matters that you're able to translate that into something that human beings will benefit from. And the best way I know to do that is to have collaborative entities where you have people with all these different skill sets coming together and trying to make something beautiful come out of that.
Really well put. I appreciate that. So a little bit of a transition in the subject matter, but I want to talk to you a little bit about 340Bs, PBMs, and other distortions that work against patient interests, you know, even dysfunctionality in the US healthcare system. And from your perspective, what are some key elements that contribute to that?
To the dysfunctionality of the healthcare system?
Yes.
I think we touched on some of it before, but Number one, medicine in this country is the most expensive in the world. And people in general, I think, in your audience may recognize that from the specific focus on our drugs. And here's where some of the fallacy comes in. So people go, oh my God, drugs cost 2, 3, 4, even 5 times more here than they do in Europe and Japan and other developed countries, which is true. What the essential next sentence of that is, so does everything else in healthcare. So if you look at everything else, CT scans, MRI scans, X-rays, any diagnostic, physical therapy, doctor office visits, hospitalizations, any kind of surgery, your hip replacement, your cardiac surgery, all of that is 2, 3, 4, 5 times more in other countries. So it's not just drugs. Drugs are not special in that regard. We focus here on drugs because it's the part that people are most exposed to, right? Because most people don't go to the hospital. Most people don't have to have surgery, but a lot of people have to take medicines. And so if they're refilling every month or a couple of months and they have these very high copays, it hurts. And they go, oh my God, drugs are horrible, they're awful, and so on. So our country has developed a system that is very capitalistic, right? Which is every part of the healthcare system is designed, the companies by definition have to be profitable in order to be successful, to get investors to give money in order to grow and so on. And in general, that's a good thing. Because it's been shown again and again that this whole capitalistic system is the one that by far produces the most progress, the most elevation of the most people in society to levels where they're living, lives where they're economically stable and so on. But left to its own devices, capitalism can also cause massive differentials between the haves and the have-nots. And in medicine, that's especially toxic because it's one thing to say, well, that person can afford a Ferrari and I can only afford a Toyota. It's another thing to say that person can afford the latest gene therapy for their child with hemophilia and I can't. Because medicine is a right. Health is a right. It's not an optional purchase. And so when you have a system that treats healthcare the way it treats iPhones or computers or cars, now you have a dislocation, right? Now, some people say, well, the way to solve that is to have what people like to call socialized medicine or single-payer medicine, where the government is the single payer for medicine. The difficulty with that is when you look at countries that do that, like Canada gets held up. Yes, there are benefits to that. You get a certain baseline level of care for everybody. But in exchange for that, you don't get a lot of the latest therapies because they won't pay for them. And you get extreme waiting periods for a lot of the procedures because, again, same idea. So the question is, can you find a middle ground where you still have the incentives to provide invention, innovativeness, new therapies, better therapies that will cure more and more cancers, more and more heart disease, more and more rare diseases of children, and so on? Can you keep that part, but at the same time have some kind of blend in the system where it's not allowed to run rampant and where the society can still afford to do it, but to provide it for everyone in the society? That is the conundrum. There are all kinds of proposals for how one might do that. And I know we're not going to have time in this brief conversation to go over that, but it is something that I believe our politicians should be pressured by all of us, everyone listening here, everyone pressured to come up with not finger-pointing solutions where you go, okay, Today, we're going to bash pharmaceuticals and we're going to squeeze them and we're going to do this and we're going to leave the rest of the system alone. No, no, you can't. You have to actually look at the entire system. How does it work? Who's being incentivized? How are they being incentivized? How do they set prices? And can we do anything about that? And remember, it's not necessarily terrible that if we were paying, let's say, twice as much for healthcare as France or Germany or UK, because if you look at our GDP per head versus their GDP, ours is higher, right? So we should be able to afford relatively higher prices as a society. It's when you get to the 4 or 5 times more where you go, well, our GDP is not, per head is not 4 or 5 times more there. So we're in real terms, it just costs a lot more here. So if we subtract out the fact that we have the most advanced medicine here, and let's put a little premium on that, you've still got this huge gap where we need to do something about it. And the only way I know to do that is to have really smart people of goodwill from all of these walks of life, from the insurance industry, from the pharmaceutical industry, from the academic medical industry, from the government, all coming around tables in think tanks and coming up with experiments and proposals. And by the way, most experiments don't work. So what you need to do is you need to have the government actually, by the way, Medicare does this in a small way. Medicare is set up to do experiments with certain payment systems over time. My view is that we're not thinking big enough. Not that they're doing too much of that. They're not doing enough of that. And what we need to do is have certain areas experiment with different ways of creating incentives at affordable prices for patients, and then seeing which ones seem to give us the best return.
Sure. It's fascinating, especially your reference to the UK. So I'm from England originally, and I lived in London before I moved to Arizona. And I remember when I went to, I had the flu or something, or a respiratory infection, and I went to a doctor's office in UK, and it felt like I was in the DMV. I waited for, 2.5 hours. I could not see an actual physician. And it was, they told me to go to the pharmacy and buy like ibuprofen or something, paracetamol. And it was very troubling to me because I felt as if I was in a government office where they had too many people, and the people who were in those offices, their role was to kind of push me out. And that's really scary to me. And I have a lot of family there, and they say that they pay out of pocket for care.
Yeah, I love your analogy of the DMV. That's that's the way people should be thinking about single payer medicine if you're not careful. And by the way, in the UK, there was a bit of a scandal there in recent years because there were some phenomenal new medicines for cancer coming out, immune therapies and so on. They were quite expensive, and they wouldn't pay for them. So the National Health Service there would not pay for them. So people were literally dying because they weren't getting access to these medicines. And then since then, under pressure, they set up a separate fund and so on. I don't even know all the ins and outs of that. But again, what you're saying highlights the fact that it's not as simple as saying, hey, let's just do what Canada does. Because no, they have a lot of their own problems. They're just different problems, right? We need to find a blend. One area that I think is very interesting is Switzerland. Switzerland has a combined system with baseline care that's single payer, but then people can pay for their own private insurance. And so there's kind of a blend. And just on a gut level, it seems to me that kind of a system is kind of what we should be thinking about, which is the government supplies everyone with a base level of access to medical care. And then you have the option to purchase private care that goes above that. But for people who are indigent below a certain level of income, the government does all of that. And then that becomes all of our contribution through tax dollars to elevating the health of the entire society.
Interesting. So in terms of the US, when we think about like 340B programs, well, first, before we dive into it, can you explain 340B drug pricing and how it's intended? And then
Yes,
how
you're raising my blood pressure. I need to take it. So for those of your viewers or listeners who are not familiar with it, the 340B program was set up quite a few years ago by Congress, and the intention was to provide medicines for the indigent who otherwise could not afford it. And frankly, as someone in industry and also a physician, I thought that was a terrific idea. I mean, that's part of what we should be doing and thinking. So originally, it was meant for quite literally clinics in poor neighborhoods or indigent neighborhoods whose clientele were indigent, and they were permitted and they were permitted to buy medicines from companies like mine and the old pharmaceutical companies at its tremendous discount, 70%, 80% off list price. And then they could make it affordable for their population. So the great idea, we took a hit, but hey, really, is it a hit? If they couldn't afford it and they weren't going to use your medicines anyway, it's our way of contributing. And in some cases, they were getting it so cheaply, it actually cost us money to give it, but that's a contribution. But, or it was just break even. What has happened in recent years is what started out as a wonderful idea has metamorphosed into a monster, into Mary Shelley's Frankenstein monster. And it's getting bigger and bigger, and it's swallowing up everything in its path. So I believe it was last year or the year before, that program was $55 billion of drug expenditure. And what has happened is, and this is where the hospitals get to play the bad guy, hospitals glommed on to the fact that this system existed, and they started going out to the borders beyond the fringes of the intent, which is they would buy these clinics in indigent areas, in rural areas. They would buy them, make them part of their system. Then they would funnel all of their drug purchase for the whole hospital system, most of which is not indigent, and they would funnel it through those clinics to get the 340B discounts. And then they would jack up the prices that they charged insurance by 500-600%. And there are papers published. There's a health affairs paper published on exactly this in the last couple of years. So the hospitals are using 340B to help fund their operations because they're getting massive markups on what they're paying, which is supposed to be for indigent, but in fact is covering the whole hospital system. So as you might expect, the drug companies have been up in arms about it, have been going to Congress. Congress has been actually looking into it and saying, oh yeah, there's a problem. The hospitals then lobby and says, well, no, because we're making, we won't survive if you don't allow us to fund ourselves with 340B. And then the local politicians who never want a hospital to close because their constituents got up in arms are going, don't do this, don't do this. And so it just continues to grow and grow and grow. That's part of the dysfunctionality of the system that needs to be addressed. But again, the mistake is if people think, okay, now I need to address that, because what's happening is you keep getting holes in the dam. And then water's coming out of that hole. So you put a finger in there like the little Dutch boy. And then over here, and there's that. And then you run out of fingers. And you're just standing there and more holes and more holes. And what you really need to do is to rebuild the dam.
How long do you think that'll take?
Well, I wish I could say I were optimistic. I'm not currently optimistic. It's one of those things where the fear is that it won't be rebuilt until it so crashes to the ground that there's nothing else to do. But so much damage will have been done that you'll be stuck.
Yeah, I really appreciate you breaking that down. I have a lot of clients that are not from the US, specifically Korean companies that work with my company. And I spend a lot of time trying to explain the 340B program to them because to them, it's just completely different than their system. So it's
Yeah.
fascinating to understand the intricacies and the way in which what was an excellent idea. You know, a lot
Yeah.
of times there's a great book right now. It's about how good intentions and bad ideas turn into disaster, but the
Yeah.
intention to
There's
begin.
that old saying about the road that, where the road leads is starting with good intentions. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. And especially when government is involved. And we haven't even touched on what the PBMs, the pharmacy benefit managers, who contract with big employers and with insurance companies to negotiate down the price of healthcare and drugs and so on. And I don't want to single them out because everyone, it's like for those who remember the old Peter Sellers Pink Panther movies where he played this feckless detective, Inspector Clouseau. And there's a wonderful line he has where, they say, well, do you suspect anyone? And he says, I suspect everyone and no one, which makes no sense at all. But in fact, it's kind of like our system, which makes no sense at all. Everyone is culpable and no one is culpable because everyone is culpable. There's no accountability or very little accountability because everyone is culpable and they're all standing in the circle with their guns pointed at everyone else in the circle. And at the end of the day, if everyone pulls the trigger, everyone's dead.
Huh.
So we got to find a different way.
Sure. Yeah, it is fascinating. I think with the PBMs, the more transparency we can have in the way in which they're building these contracts. Sometimes they're so secretive. Many times they're so closed book.
They're always so secretive, right?
Yeah.
And they may be getting a 40 or 50% rebate from the drug that we're selling to insurance companies. So we put a list price of the drug there. Let's say it's an expensive new drug. It's $1,000 a month, which is not expensive compared to the 100 or 300,000 or even $1 million a year genetic therapies now, but or $1 million. But let's say it's $1,000 a month, and they say we need you to give us $400 back on every prescription. So we do that because we need to get on the formulary so that they'll give patients access. What do they use the $400 for? Okay, part of it is their profit, and nobody really knows how much of it they're keeping for their profit. Part of it is they give it back to the insurance companies and or the big employers who, and the insurance companies, do they use it to lower the copays and deductibles for their patients to get their drugs? No, they do not. The patients are still paying, 20%, 25% of $1,000 or whatever, which is a lot of money for most people. They use it so they can lower their premiums for the insurance companies so they can attract more healthy people to their plan because that's their business model. The more healthy people, the less they have to pay out, the more of the premium they get to keep, and there you are. So, and there are laws governing that, and but still, there are a lot of loopholes. So, as one of my colleagues, who's also a doctor who works for a PBM, has said when we've given talks together, he said, we have a system in which sick people are subsidizing premiums, insurance premiums for healthy people. Which, think about it, it's perverse, right? Ideally, if pharmaceutical companies are giving back that kind of money, why wouldn't you use it to lower the out-of-pocket costs for patients who need the drugs, right? That's just one of many, many perversities that we have in the system.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Well, I'd like to close out with something a little bit brighter. What are you excited? Like, what books are you reading? What's next? I know your mom's birthday is coming up, and you're going to show her this episode.
I'm going to show her your intro.
What are you reading? I want to start there. What are you reading? What do you recommend?
Well, so right now I have a pile of books on my night table that is so high that I'm going to need to take probably 6 months off to just read them all because
Of
work
course you
gets in the way, everything gets away. And I also read copiously. I read, because I'm so involved in the things we're talking about, I read a lot of science periodicals, news periodicals, business periodicals. So I subscribe to about 14 or 15 different periodicals, including the daily paper. I 3 daily papers, plus magazines and so on, Scientific American, Science, Nature, you name it, the New England Journal of Medicine, but also, as you would expect from our discussion, Harper's Magazine and The New Yorker, because I want to nourish that side. But in terms of books, the jag I'm on and that I'm most excited about now is trying to read everything that Walter Isaacson has written, his biographies. I find I do like fiction, but I love biographies in history. Like Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel. It's an older book, but I recommend it to everyone. It's essential reading to understand sort of geopolitics mixed with science and history. It's a phenomenal work, and anything else he's written. But Walter Isaacson is himself, in my view, a genius. He's a genius biographer, and he writes about geniuses. So he has a biography of Elon Musk and a biography of Steve Jobs, biography of Jennifer Doudna and her collaborators on CRISPR. He has another one about just innovators, where he goes through a bunch of them. If you look up Walter Isaacson, just go to Amazon or wherever your Barnes and Nobles, wherever your bookstore is, just start reading his books. He's a phenomenal biographer, and his mission is to give a sense of what is it that goes into genius? How do these people, why are these people geniuses and not some others? What characterizes them? Are there common threads? What's unique about them? And I just find it a stunning, stunning body of work that he's put together.
Well, thank you so much. You can see my face lighting up because I'm an avid reader like you are, and I have a big pile of books, and I'm really looking forward to adding more so I can have, a bigger list of books to read, and I will add Walter to the list. I really do appreciate it, though. I thank you for taking the time to share your stories with us, to share your wisdom, to share your genius. It's an honor to talk to you always, and your humor is always on point.
Well, I'm going to demur on the genius, but I try to stand on the shoulders of geniuses to see as far as I can. And that's what I think the best that most of us can do. Thank you for this opportunity, Sadhna. It's really a joy. I love what you're doing, just injecting that humanism into the world of science, medicine, and technology. And I think it's essential, and it's a privilege to be part of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us. I'm Dr. Sadhna Bokhiria, and this is Leader Voices. This show is brought to you by the American Express Leadership Academy Alumni Network and leaderstories.org. Leader Voices is audio engineered by Robbie Ladd and produced by Creepandian team at OTVO Digital. Special thanks to Caitlin Johnson and Michael Chang. Thank you, and see you in the next episode.